and play on 2nd and 10. That's his youth right there.
Tagovailoa trying to make up for it. Fires to the end zone. Touchdown! Alabama wins!
So today I'll be continuing my college football game-by-game prediction and roster preview videos with the Georgia Bulldogs. So starting on the offensive side of the ball, Georgia was good here last year. They averaged 30.4 points per game, and I expect them to average similar to that this year. So at quarterback, Gunnar Stockton comes back, who I thought had a good but not great year last year. As a passer, I thought he was only a little above average. He threw for 2,894 yards and started all 14 games for them, and he was very accurate, completing 69.7% of his passes, and did have a really good touchdown interception ratio at 24-5, and did have a solid 7.5 yards per throw average, but as a runner he's well above average for a quarterback. He ran 129 times last season for 462 and 10 touchdowns, averaging 3.6 a carry. And wide receiver, though, is the one concerning position on Georgia's team, because they lose Zachariah Branch, and I know you may be thinking he's the only good wide receiver that they lose, so they should be fine. But imagine how bad their unit would have been last year if they hadn't have had Branch. And Georgia's top returning wide receiver only had 18 catches for 276 last year, and they didn't get a lot of help at wide receiver through the portal either. Now, running back, they're in great shape. They returned Nate Frazier, who is one of the most physical running backs in college football, great at running between the tackles. He started all 14 games for them last year and had 947 yards and 6 touchdowns on 173 carries and averaged 5.5 a carry. I think he has a good chance of being a 1,000-yard rusher this year. And they've got Chauncey Bowens coming back, the speedy running back number 2. And he played in 12 games last year and had on 103 carries, 526 yards and 6 touchdowns, averaging 5.1 a carry. And Georgia averaged 182.1 rushing yards per game last season, and I expect them to average similar to that this season, because they should have a top 5 offensive line in the country, because while I know they lose Monroe Freeling, who was a first-round draft pick, they return full-time starters at 3 positions on the offensive line. Left guard and right tackle are the only positions where they don't return full-time starters. At left tackle, they've got Ernest Green coming back for what will be his 4th season as a starter. Now, he only played in 9 games last year because of an injury, but he didn't allow a sack all year. And they've got Drew Bobo coming back, who is one of the best, if not the best, center in college football. He dealt with injury problems last year too, so he was limited to 11 games, but he didn't allow a sack or a quarterback pressure. And then at right guard, they've got Dontrell Glover coming back, who was a freshman All-American last year, and he played and started all 14 games for them and didn't allow a sack all season. So now on the defensive side, Georgia only gave up 16.8 points per game last year on average, which was top 10 in the country, and I expect them to have another top 10 defense this year. And I actually expect their average to go down in points that they gave up because Georgia's defense improved from the year before by a little bit because of how great their run defense was. Their run defense was the best it had been since 2022, which is the last year they won the national title. It ranked fourth in the country, giving up only 81.5 yards per game. But there were two things about Georgia's defense last year that were not normal. They did not have a very good pass rush, and they did have some struggles in the secondary. At the beginning of the season, they pretty much didn't have a pass rush. Now, they did get a lot better at pressuring the quarterback later on, but they still struggled to get the quarterback down. They only had 20 sacks last year, which only ranked 107th in the country. Now, I do expect their pass rush to be better this year. They've got on the defensive line Gabe Harris coming back, who played and started in 13 games and had 26 tackles and a sack and 19 quarterback pressures. And they've got Elijah Griffin coming back, the number one defensive line recruit of 2025. He had last year 22 tackles and a sack and 13 quarterback pressures and a forced fumble and pass breakup, and he was freshman All-American. He did play in all 14 games, but he wasn't a starter, which he will be this year. And they've got Jordan Hall. He only played in 8 games last year because of a season-ending knee injury, but he was great against the run, but he wasn't very good of a tackler, only having 12 tackles, and he couldn't get after the quarterback. And they've got Xavier McLeod coming back. He played in 14 games and started 6 games last year, and he was kind of like Jordan Hall in that he wasn't a great tackler, only 17 tackles, and not that great at getting after the quarterback. Didn't have a sack and only had 5 pressures, but he did have 2 pass breakups and was very good at stopping the run. Now, they do lose Christian Miller, who was probably their best run stopper a year ago. And then at linebacker, they do lose their best one last year, at C.J. Allen, but they're still going to be really good here. They've got Quintavious Johnson coming back, who had last year 35 tackles and 2 sacks and 5 quarterback pressures and 5 pass breakups and a forced fumble. And they've got Raylan Wilson, who had last year 74 tackles and 2.5 sacks and a pass breakup and 17 quarterback pressures. And Chris Cole, who had 59 tackles and 4.5 sacks and 2 pass breakups and 16 total quarterback pressures. And Georgia's secondary gave up on average 216.5 yards per game, which is not bad, but it's the worst it's been since at least before they won those back-to-back national championships. And the same goes for their pass rush. It was the worst it's been since at least before they won those 2 national championships. But Georgia does lose Dalen Everett, who was a really good corner. But I expect their secondary to be better this year because they do return their other 2 really good players last year from in the secondary. Elias Robinson at corner and then KJ Bolden at safety. And they bring in 3 good defensive backs from the portal, which is not something that Kirby Smart uses a lot, but Kirby Smart loves to run those 5 defensive back formations. But last year, Georgia's secondary had some games where it was like they weren't even there, like the Tennessee game, and then the first half of the first game with Alabama, and then both games with Ole Miss. So Elias Robinson last year had 20 tackles only, but he had 7 pass breakups and 4 interceptions and was freshman All-American. He was the #1 cornerback recruit of 2025.
Well, it's going to bode well in their favor.
King. Downfield strike. Wow, what an effort by Ellis Robinson with the interception.
It comes down with his...
And KJ Bolden had 76 tackles and 5 pass breakups and 2 interceptions last season, and he was the #1 safety recruit of 2024. And in 2024, he was freshman All-American. And then at cornerback, they bring in Gentry Williams from Oklahoma, a 4-star corner who hasn't played a lot since 2023. In 2024, he missed pretty much the whole year with a shoulder injury, and then in 2025, he missed all but 4 games with the same injury. But when he was able to play, he was a big contributor to Oklahoma's secondary, and I expect him to be a big contributor to Georgia's secondary too if he's healthy. And then at safety, they bring in Jamari Riddle from East Carolina, who had last year in 12 games 70 tackles, 6 pass breakups, 3 interceptions, and a fumble recovery. And Khalil Barnes from Clemson, he was only a 3-star recruit, but he's played in 37 games the past 3 years, and he was freshman All-American in 2023. And in all of that, he has 139 tackles and 7 interceptions and 11 pass breakups. And on special teams, that Georgia returns one of the best kickers in the country, Peyton Woodring. He made 17 of 19 field goal attempts last season, including 5 of 6 from 40 to 49 yards away and 3 of 4 from 50 plus yards away. And he's pretty much automatic when it comes to short field goals. So now for the predictions. That starting with these first 2 games at Tennessee State and Western Kentucky, Georgia should be able to win both of these games by however much they want to. They'll be able to play their backups the whole second half, except Kirby Smart is not as big into running the score way up in these types of games as some coaches are. So now on the road at Arkansas, there's too much of a talent and coaching advantage for Georgia over Arkansas right now for Arkansas to stand a chance. This will be a win for Georgia and probably a blowout win, especially at the line of scrimmage. Georgia will have a huge advantage. They're going to push around Arkansas on both sides of the line of scrimmage to where Arkansas, I think, is going to have a very hard time scoring and keeping drives going in this game. And Georgia, I think, is going to have no problem at chewing up clock and at getting into the 30s in this one. So now their first real challenge of the season at home against Oklahoma. So this is going to be a low-scoring defensive battle, I think, because Oklahoma, I think their defense is going to be at least as good as Georgia's will be, and I think Georgia will be held into the low 20s in this game. And John Mateer and Gunnar Stockton are very similar quarterbacks. The one position, though, where Georgia, I think, does have a pretty big advantage over Oklahoma is offensive line. And because of that, I think Georgia will be able to get a couple of big run plays that Oklahoma won't, and I think that'll be what makes the difference. So I'm going to go with Georgia to get this win. So now Vanderbilt Pavi may have not really been as good as he thinks he is, and may have went undrafted because he has a big mouth. But that still doesn't take away that he was a Vanderbilt legend, and Vanderbilt wouldn't have stood a chance of beating Georgia last year with him. I don't know why they would stand a chance of beating Georgia this year without him, and with Georgia returning 68% of their production. Now, I think Vanderbilt is going to be a decent team this year, and I think they might be able to keep it close for a half with Georgia, but at the end of the day, the talent on Georgia's team is just going to be too much for Vanderbilt to handle, and Georgia, I think, will pull away in the second half and end up winning pretty comfortably. I don't really think it'll be a blowout quite, but I think Georgia will win this one by around 17 points. So now on the road at Alabama. With Georgia being 5-0 at this point, and already having what should be a big win over Oklahoma, especially with this game being on the road, it feels like it'll be about time for a loss, and that's something that Alabama's given Georgia a lot through the years. And now Georgia, I think, is better than Alabama, like they have been the last 2 years that they've lost to Alabama, especially at the line of scrimmage. I think Georgia has the advantage. But even though Alabama did just lose a first round quarterback, Kalen DeBoer certainly earned my trust when it comes to developing a quarterback after only being a Power 5 head coach for 4 years and already having two quarterbacks drafted in the first round. I think the quarterback play at Alabama is going to be really good again this year. And Georgia does not have a wide receiver on their roster anywhere close to the level of Ryan Williams. I think Ryan Williams will probably have a big game in this one. And Alabama is, I think, going to be better this year than last year at running the football. And I just can't really imagine Kirby Smart winning the first meeting of the season with Alabama. Now, if they were to play each other again like last year, I would probably go with Georgia, but I'm going to go with Alabama to get the win in a close one. So now Auburn. Auburn has recruited well enough recently to have a chance to beat Georgia, but I don't see it happening this year, even if Alex Gullish turns out to be the right coach for them, because the culture at Auburn has been so bad under Hugh Freeze these last couple of years that I think it will take Gullish until year two, if he is the right coach for them, to get Auburn to being a serious college football playoff contender. Now, if Gullish is the right coach, though, for Auburn, they will at some point beat Georgia again. And Auburn this year, I do think, is going to have one of the better offenses in the SEC, with Gullish being an offensive expert, and his quarterback Byron Brown, I think, is going to be one of the SEC's better quarterbacks this year. But Georgia is one team that I think is going to be able to stop them because their defensive line, I think, is going to have a big advantage over Auburn's offensive line. So I don't see this game being that close. I think Georgia wins it by at least a couple of scores because it's at Georgia. Now, if the game was at Auburn, I think it would be more interesting. So now their biggest rival, Florida. So while Florida does recruit well enough every year to have a chance to beat Georgia, they were never going to beat Georgia as long as Billy Napier was their coach. And even if, though, John Sumrall is the right coach for Florida, they're not going to beat Georgia this year, but they will eventually beat Georgia, but the culture was so bad at Florida under Billy Napier that even if Summerall is the right coach for them, I think it's going to take him till year two to make them great. For example, Mike Elko, the great coach at Texas A&M, their culture was so bad under Jimbo Fisher when he took over there. So there wasn't much improvement in his first year at Texas A&M, even though they had plenty of talent to be great immediately like Florida does. But then in his second year, they were great. And I do think because this is a rivalry, though, this will be a pretty close game. But I think Georgia's defense will hold Florida within 20 points and get them the win. On the road at Ole Miss. Ole Miss, I think, has a better offense than Georgia, and I think Georgia has a better defense than Ole Miss. But this is the one game that I think Georgia's defense is going to struggle in. Now, I do think they'll slow down Keywan Lacey, but I think Trinidad Chambliss is going to give their secondary a lot of problems. Again, now Georgia's offense, I think, is going to give Ole Miss quite a bit of trouble too, especially with their run game. To where I think this will be a very close game, and the only shootout type of game on Georgia's season. But Ole Miss does have home field advantage, so I am going to go with Ole Miss to beat Georgia again. Now Missouri. So since Missouri joined the SEC, Georgia is 11-1 against them, and the only loss that Georgia has to Missouri was Missouri's best season ever, and Georgia was having a down year. So that should tell you something about this game. And there's too much of a talent and coaching advantage for Georgia in this one for them to lose, in my opinion. I think Georgia gets this win by a couple of scores. I'd be shocked if Missouri got over 21 points in this game, and I think Georgia will get in the 30s in this one. South Carolina on the road. So I think South Carolina's quarterback, Lenore Sellers, is probably a little bit better than Gunnar Stockton, and Nick Harbor at wide receiver for them. Georgia doesn't have a wide receiver with his ceiling, except that's not going to matter because Georgia has a way better offensive line than South Carolina does. And on the defensive line, well, Georgia doesn't have a pass rusher as good as Dylan Stewart at South Carolina. They're going to be way better at stopping the run than South Carolina is going to be. So Georgia is going to be at a huge advantage running the football in this game. And I would certainly take Georgia's secondary over South Carolina's too. I think this game will probably be close for a while, but I do look for Georgia to pull away at some point in the second half and get the win by a couple of scores. Now their rival Georgia Tech. So it's shown on the field the last couple of years that Georgia Tech is a good bit closer to the level of Georgia than they were right before the start of the Brent Key era. But it's also shown on the field when they've played the last couple of years that Georgia Tech is still a good bit behind Georgia when it comes to talent and coaching and depth, and I don't expect that to change this year. Now, I do think this will be a pretty good game like it's been the last couple of years, but I do expect Georgia to win it by about a touchdown like they did last year, but I do think it'll be higher scoring than last year. Last year, the final score was only 16-9. It was like Iowa playing against themselves. So my prediction for Georgia is 10-2 overall and 7-2 in the conference. This will for sure get them back to the college football playoff, but there's a good chance it'll get them back into the SEC championship. So that'll be it with this video. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.